You do your film study, but if you never actually get into a game, what good does all of that stuff use? And I know that, for me personally, one of the things that has been an incredible blessing is that, given the opportunity to be part of this ministry adventure that we have here, it's forced me to apply, like, the stuff that I'm like reading in scripture, and and I think has had a really big impact in terms of my own life, my own spiritual development. One of the things you find out, like when you get into the game, is that, there's another team on the field and the other team hits back and they hit hard. And it's when you encounter that resistance, that's what, at least in my situation, forces me to pray, forces me to open the Bible and start actually thinking about like applying those things. And all too often, again, I think part of where we are is that the folks who are in our churches don't get an opportunity, to get into the game. I was thinking, like, in preparing this, you realize like the best ministry team that was ever assembled, and like there was this guy like Jesus who put it together basically, had 11 amateurs and one ministry professional, and that guy was bivocational. He was supporting himself by making tents. And so I don't know that the intent here was ever, for, the privilege of ministry to be something that was devoted simply to a priestly class or guys who happen to have graduated with a seminary degree. And a bunch of us were sitting around at the bar at Bonefish Grill on Thursday night. And one of the things that was impactful, and, Pastor Craig, if he's here this morning, Craig Johnson, who spoke yesterday, had mentioned the fact that we're going through a time where, what God's really up to is that he's doing a lot of pruning. And so that there's a lot of stuff that's not working and sort of like, branches that aren't real fruitful that are being cut away. It's kind of a painful process while it's going on. But one of the things that we can anticipate is that there's going to be a time of growth that's going to follow shortly thereafter. And the truth is that, while this is a time of great challenges, it's also a time of great opportunity for all of us. And there are 4 key areas where I see a lot of opportunity. That number one is that, let's admit it, that we as a church have developed a reputation problem. And that, particularly among young people, that there are folks who see us as being, too political, that, associated with certain things that they're uncomfortable with. And I made a new friend but here, I don't know if Bree is here. I got a chance to spend a little bit of time with her. One of the things that you'd recognize is that for those of us who have an opportunity to spend time in academia, the culture is becoming increasingly hostile to Christianity. Like in my, in my teaching at medical school world, and when I start talking to like, my non-Christian peers, the thing that opens people's eyes up the most and challenges their preconceived notions about Christianity and the church is when we do the kind of stuff that all of you do on a daily basis, ministering to folks with disabilities. It's like Clinic calls me up and goes, we've heard that you guys have a bunch of churches in the area that are doing respite care. Where can we find a website and where can we find those places? Because the people that we're seeing at our Center for Autism desperately need this stuff. That is what people notice. And so if the church is going to do something about its image problem, the folks who are going to lead the way are all of us who are engaged in ministry to the most vulnerable. Because when we're doing that and when we're putting folks, again, the least of these at the forefront, that's when we best represent Jesus, and that's when we're most impactful on an elite culture that's very hostile to a lot of the stuff that we believe. I think the second opportunity is, how do we adapt and assimilate technology as a tool for promoting and building incarnational community? And I know that's like one of these big words, but the purpose of this and why we look at using technology is it's to advance and promote the notion of us gathering together in the flesh with one another, to worship, to learn, to do service, to experience community. And I don't know about you guys, but I think one of the things that I hope you will all notice after we've had the opportunity to get together the last couple of days is that the Zoom meetings are going to feel a lot better and feel a lot more productive after we've had an opportunity to hang around with each other in the same room together, and hug each other, have dinner together, have hung out. And a little bit of this stuff in terms of being in community in person goes a long way. And so how do we use the technology to build upon the in-person opportunities for the families that we serve with disability? Opportunity number 3 is the increased openness to mental health ministry. Because as more and more of these pastors are dealing with burnout and in a situation where they're having to go ahead and seek out services for themselves, for their family, a lot of stigma about this is going away. The other thing is that this situation is not getting better. And you think, well, pandemic's winding down, people aren't wearing masks anymore. I have more kids coming into my office than I did a year ago. And I have never in 36 years of practice had such a hard time finding counselors for kids who needed them. You take a look at some of the other things going on in the world, like, for example, what's going on right now with kids in Ukraine. Kids as a result of pandemic. There are 200,000 orphans in the United States who've lost parents during COVID. And the extent to which the trauma associated with that is going to be a lasting challenge. And an opportunity to step forth as a church is, a big deal. We're going to be wrestling with this for a really long time. And then I think the fourth opportunity is that the disability ministry movement and what we think about as disability ministry continues to expand year by year. And what I mean by this is that I thought about the way that disability ministry has evolved has been in 4 waves. The first wave was including people with physical disabilities, which is Johnny and Friends. The second wave was the whole special needs ministry movement and the recognition of some of the challenges that families had when they had kids, particularly on the deep end of the autism spectrum. The third wave is the mental health ministry movement. And what I see coming over the horizon, the fourth wave, and what might ultimately end up being the largest one in terms of serving the most people, is looking at disabilities of aging and memory care. And Tori White, has been here and, did a really nice workshop looking at that, I believe, yesterday. So, okay, so what do we do with all of this? And so, what's the plan going forward? So I think that there's 3 things we need to address. Number one, even though you have all these pastors who are running around updating their LinkedIn profile, and that in a lot of places, that they're really struggling. I think that one of the things we do is we have to be really intentional in terms of building relationships outside of the disability ministry community in the larger church. We got lots and lots of wonderful applications to speak at the conference this year. One of the things we don't need is when you guys submit for next year, we don't need folks submitting quick takes talking about why the church needs to do disability ministry. I don't think that there is anybody in this room right now who needs to be convinced of that reality and that that's an issue. What we need to do is that, we need to get in front of a room of 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 senior pastors so that, by the way, I think the Lord's going to use Lamar to do some kind of big things on that front, but and again, I think that he's uniquely qualified and uniquely gifted to step up and do some of this. But we got to get in front of the decision makers and the folks who are able to green light and to give their blessing to and to devote resources to sustainable disability ministry. And so, whenever any of us have opportunities to do that, I think that's somewhere we need to work together organizationally and take advantage of those opportunities to as great a degree as we can. Now, look at so again, it's great that we're doing this, but we need to have like folks talking to guys at Exponential, folks talking to guys at Catalyst, and like these things that like we had 5,000, 10,000 like senior pastors going and being in attendance. So, part of this is also involving, getting denominations to embrace disability ministry. So, again, if there's anything that we could do collectively, to be able to serve or promote the growth of this within your denomination, that's something we would love to do. The second piece of this is that we need to be able to offer high quality, live disability ministry training. And almost as important, the opportunity for disability ministry leaders to be in community with one another on a regular basis. And I think that the goal here is that we would like folks to be able to get this high quality training on it no less than an annual basis, for 90% of pastors and church leaders to be able to access this within a half-day drive of where they live. And again, it's not just like going somewhere for a lecture. And I think something that all of you will have noticed or experienced when we've gotten together is it's the opportunity to be with one another, and to brainstorm ideas and to develop relationships. And for folks who are doing disability ministry in a region to be able to develop natural systems of support. So I know, at least for our team, that's going to be a really big priority going forward. And I was encouraged by the folks who want to start something in Portland that we came across, like at the meeting. I know that there's somebody here from the Southern California Disability Ministry Conference that's taking place 2 weeks from today in San Diego, I believe. And so that's a very important goal going forward, because leaders need connections and innovators need platforms, and they need opportunities to be able to share their ideas with others in the church. And then finally, we need to give Christians who have a sense of calling the tools, the connections, and the support to be able to do ministry that is innovative and highly relational. Now, I made another new friend here, and this was Ryan from Johnny and Friends. So we were hanging around talking like the other night, and Ryan had a quote that I think I am going to be using fairly frequently, which is, we're talking about this issue of training. He goes, you come to these conferences and there's a bunch of parents who want to start ministries and there are no senior pastors there. And so I was reflecting upon that. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, if this happens conference after conference after conference, is it possible that maybe God wants us to resource the parents to be able to do ministry? And those are the folks to whom he's giving the call. I want you to take a look at, I think, go ahead and like advance the slide. And talking specifically about this issue, one more, and talk about this issue specifically with parents. So this is a team picture from those of us who were gathered at this site last year, for IFL. And that looks like a bunch of parents to me. The parent on the far left is Marie Cook. They have a company in Orlando where they make boats. Marie leads Nathaniel's Hope. They have the largest church-based respite care network in North America. They're putting on an event for disability awareness for 30,000 people in downtown Orlando on the first weekend in June. And they just bought 150 acres of land in Orlando to build a residential community for our kids when they grow up. Next to her is Sandra Peoples, who again is serving on our board and has probably written the best book I've ever seen for parents who have kids with disabilities. Sandra and her friend Tiffany Crow started one of these disability ministry conferences in the Houston area. In the middle of the picture, we see Doc Hunsley, and Doc, pediatrician who has a son with disability. And that their conference is about the same size as ours, and they are accepting applications for people who would like to speak there in October. um, and that they're having incredible impact with churches across the Midwest. Next to Doc is Matt Mooney, another parent who is a lawyer who, through 99 Balloons, has the second largest disability ministry network in North America. And next to him is Cindy Farini, who has, been, for years, written books, has been a speaker for family life and an advocate for families who've been challenged by disability in the church. So, parents sometimes do a really good job with this stuff. Um, Other places, like Jillian Palmiota wasn't able to be with us today, but one of the things that Jillian did was that the families, who had been served by her congregation, went and started 20 house churches where they were reaching other families with disabilities, like when COVID shut the churches down. And then the other piece of this, when we start thinking about folks who are God's using, if you go to the next slide, are God's using people themselves, raising up leaders who themselves have disabilities. And that I think that and one of the things we've seen here at this conference is how many people are out there who are truly uniquely gifted and talented, and called to do this kind of work. And it's going to be folks like Lamar who are going to lead the way, going forward, in terms of influencing the church. And so that the thing that's like the most cool about this, and I think has to be like the most God thing ever, is that ultimately, I think that God's going to end up using like the least of these and the most vulnerable of these, not just to transform disability ministry, but I think that we're going to end up being the lead agents of change in terms of helping the church move forward in the context of this very hostile culture. One last thing, and then I'll close and turn over to Steve. So that one thing I want you to think about today is that everyone gets to play, and in fact, everyone has to play. And if you take a look in toward the back of your program books, you will see like a 2-page spread, with some specific questions. And Catherine at the very end of the day is going to come and give you guys some challenges, so that you don't leave here, without getting a role on the team. And so I want you guys thinking a little bit as you go through today. Where's God leading you? What's the next step he's asking you to take? Who can help you stay accountable? And I want you to meet at least 3 different people before you walk out these doors, at like 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock today, who are going to help to resource you and support you and encourage you for the future. Thanks again to all of you guys for coming, and enjoy getting into the game. Thank you.